Hello and welcome to Parallax, an IPCS series of podcasts. I am Kamal, your host for today. The international spotlight on China has increased since 2020, beginning with criticism of Beijing's handling of the pandemic. And there have been a number of issues where China has been at the center of conversations on international relations, be it the pushback against China's trade and diplomatic coercion, or its support to Russia in the ongoing Ukraine conflict, or its engagement in a tech competition with the US. Closer home, China poses a heightened military threat to India, especially after the Galwan clashes. And Taiwan, meanwhile, continues to be an important geopolitical flashpoint. Some criticism of China's aggressive behavior has attributed its behavior to domestic factors. For example, the run-up to the party congress last year was seen as a critical period where Xi Jinping sought to signal toughness on sensitive foreign policy issues. But with the power transition playing out as per Xi's script, can we expect China's foreign policy to moderate? Or will Beijing's foreign policy positions harden further, as Xi's words and deeds so far seem to suggest? Today, we will discuss some very important questions related to Chinese foreign policy in this context. And to do this, we have a very special guest, Dr. Jabin T. Jacob. He is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at the Shiv Nadar Institution of Eminence, and also is someone who has been at IPCS earlier in his career. Hello and welcome, Dr. Jacob. Thank you for joining us at Parallax today.
Thank you, Kamal. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. Before I begin our conversation, Dr. Jacob, you are somebody who has been at IPCS and you have played a very important role in shaping the institution as well as the China research program in particular. Could you please share your experiences from your time at IPCS with us?
Thank you, Kamal. Well, I wouldn't classify my own role as very important. I think it was one role among many. There were many people in the China program, involved in the China program, trying to get it off the ground. I was fortunate to be at the IPCS at a very early stage in my academic career. It was a place for great learning. And I have to thank you for bringing me back in touch with the IPCS through this program. In fact, IPCS is where I started my career in the policy world. And I think it is an organization that has done pioneering work in India in the think tank scene, not just in China studies, but across nuclear issues, South Asia. And, it is also where many researchers were trained and their skills honed. And, many of these researchers actually went on from the IPCS to other think tanks and academic institutions, universities, and so on, and helped them grow. Built many of these young think tanks and helped them grow. And I know, this is a contribution that is somewhat less known perhaps today because we simply have a very large number of think tanks and it's sort of underappreciated. But the early role that the IPCS founders, Mr. P.R. Chari and Major Dipankar Banerjee, played, I think this should be understood. They had a very no-nonsense style in running the organization, and they were genuine mentors of young researchers. I think there wasn't too much of a hierarchy at the IPCS. They realized that you needed to give youngsters their head, their space if you needed creative thinking. And they really trained a very large number of people who have done extremely well since then. And I think many of these effects that we see, if India's think tank scene is exploding or growing, I think a lot of the credit will have to be attributed to the IPCS. At the China program, of course, my PhD was an out-and-out Chinese domestic politics topic. But at the IPCS, obviously, in the policy world, the interest was on India-China. So that's where I developed a second hat, as it were. I had the academic hat of Chinese domestic politics, but I also had the policy hat of looking at India-China relations. And, there was a great deal of encouragement for me to deploy what I learned in the Chinese domestic political scene to understand and interpret India-China relations. There was encouragement for me to go and travel along the India-China border, for example. So, get firsthand experience of what things were like. So I owe a great deal to the IPCS, and I am where I am because of my time at the IPCS.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. I think you mentioned a lot of things, and especially I think Professor Chari and General Banerjee at that point of time, I think felt the need for an institution like this, an independent think tank, which they found was missing, and they actually pioneered this. And yeah, I think great to hear about your experience and the role, I think both you have played in IPCS and IPCS has played in your own experience. Thanks for sharing that. Dr. Jacob, I want to begin this conversation by talking about some big picture observations that you might have on Chinese foreign policy at the very broad level, in terms of what is it that you feel that scholars and analysts get right and get wrong when they read China?
I think, first of all, Indians, ought to give themselves a bit of credit. I think by and large, Indians get China. I think it's a sort of a natural instinct because, look, we are two large countries with very large populations, some of the same problems of administration, problems with understanding and dealing with history, problems of dealing with Western colonialism and imperialism, and concerns about national identity and stability. So in many ways, if you think of it, who better than Indians to understand and interpret China? However, our problem has always been that this is a Western dominated world order. The knowledge systems, production systems are all from the West or dominated by the West. We do most of our research in English. And so we do not actually have access to some of our own creativity, because some of it might not necessarily be available in English. We do not involve, for example, our border populations. The populations most in touch with Tibet and Xinjiang or our neighborhood in our foreign policy decision making. It's a very centralized system that we have, and therefore I think there are shortcomings because of that. Plus, we've not really invested in academics or the academic study of China. I mean, yes, we have policy concerns and immediate concerns of security, etc., but you can only deal with these over the long term. You can only get temporary solutions in the present, but you need to be able to invest in language capabilities, academic research, etc., which is not something that the Indian government has really spent much effort on, which is why, IPCS, when it came, it was a pioneering institution because here were two individuals deciding that, look, we needed more creativity in Indian foreign policy and security policy making from outside the four walls of government. Now, having said that, I think Indian diplomats have largely gotten China right. I think in 1989, when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened or protests were happening, the West was certain that the communist regime would fall, China was in for democracy and so on. Our diplomats sitting in Beijing said nothing doing, this is not happening, right? So we had a much better sense of what was going on in China. Similarly, over the decades, I think Indian diplomats and policymakers have been warning the West, look, this Chinese behavior is of concern. China says one thing, does another thing on the borders, in the economic realm. And it has only taken until the last few years for the West to actually wake up and realize that, well, what the Indians were saying is true all along. Even now, I think India has been leading the front in the sense that, it was only after India banned Chinese apps, etc., that other countries started banning apps. So, we've been very strict about Confucius Institutes, etc., for a very long time. The West sort of cottoned on pretty late. So I would say, it is time that the rest of the world sort of woke up and understood that India has a much, much better sense of China than the West does. India and China's neighbors, because they actually, who has faced Chinese soldiers in actual combat in the last few decades but India? So I think this is something that we need to be able to promote and talk about confidently. We have gotten China right. We have some shortcomings, certainly. I think those shortcomings of our own making, and we need to be able to fix those by greater interaction between government and civil society, government and research think tanks, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, Dr. Jacob. And you rightly mentioned, I think, that a lot of conversations that we are probably having at the international level today were sort of anticipated by some of our scholars and diplomats a few decades ago. Dr. Jacob, I want to talk about the big picture Chinese foreign policy, like I said. And in that context, we've seen that, of course, the party congress happened in China last year, and Xi Jinping got an unprecedented third term in power. And since then, and if we can begin by looking at some of the signals that have come out of China, this year, March, of course, Xi Jinping had made a very interesting speech about foreign policy issues, where he talked about how China is being contained in a box, and his language was quite aggressive. And meanwhile, since then, also Chinese military has been ordered to improve combat training, increase research on combat situations, and develop reserve forces. At the same time, at a societal level, there have been efforts to groom civilians for a warlike situation. A lot of movies like Born to Fly, which are basically military-focused movies, have been promoted. So how do you view all of these signals that have been coming out of China since the two sessions this year, but more generally, Xi Jinping's third term so far? And, would it be right to interpret them as efforts to prepare, efforts to prepare the Chinese military and potentially even the population for a war?
So I think we make a mistake if we interpret all of this military talk, military saber rattling, as purely a military phenomenon, right? For the Communist Party of China, and let's be very clear that this is a party state that is devoted to keeping one party in power over and above any Chinese national interest. So in that sense, China is not a normal state. China is a state which is trying to keep one political party in power in that state. So that political party will look after its own interests, even sometimes at the cost of what other countries would normally interpret as national interest. So the first objective of any of these statements or these actions is political. Does it strengthen the Communist Party of China in power in China, right? So when there is this talk about strengthening the Chinese military or preparing for external threats, it is partly, at least, it's only partly a response to, the actual situation outside. I mean, there is always going to be competition between great powers. There's always going to be competition or differences of opinion about where somebody's border lies, etc. So, this is something that most nations will have. But most rational nations will try and avoid war. They will try and avoid talk of war. They will want to actually negotiate solutions to these situations. China under the Communist Party doesn't do that. So you're right in pointing out Xi Jinping's speeches talking about, real combat, training for real combat, preparing for real combat situations. But this is the other part of this is to tell the Chinese people that the Communist Party of China has the capacity to defend Chinese interests. Because as the legitimacy of the Communist Party is challenged, with economic problems at home, social conflict, the poor management of COVID, and so on, this party, the deal between the party and the people was that, the people will support the party in power as long as the party delivers economic goods, right? Economic efficiency. But over time, we see that income inequality in China has grown. The party is not capable or has been unsuccessful in managing the economy, beyond a point. I mean, we have huge growth, etc., but this growth has come at a huge cost of environmental damage, rising inequality between, personal income inequality as well as regional inequality. So this is not a very equal society or equal equitable growth that we see in China. And this, of course, challenges the legitimacy of the party. And when this happens, then you try and bring the people together on the basis of external threats. And, propaganda movies such as the one that you just mentioned, Top Gun ripoffs, such as Born to Fly and so on. So we should also be then careful that we do not overinterpret what China is doing on the military front. Some of these things have to be dealt politically. This is a question of countering Chinese narratives. It is useful. External threats are useful domestically for the Communist Party, because then, it's like the American election campaign say, you don't change a horse midstream. When there's a war going on, the incumbent president usually has a better chance of winning re-election. So, this is what I think the Communist Party is also trying to do, that if there's a constant sense of threat from the outside world, the Chinese people will forget about internal problems and focus outwardly. So it's a constant need to play up threats outside externally, so that people take attention away from the shortcomings or the failings of the ruling party. So that's what's going on. I mean, that's the political situation, and everything else is a subset of this particular aspect of internal Chinese domestic politics.
I think you mentioned about external threats, and I think the biggest and the most the critical focus of Chinese foreign policy is, of course, its relationship with the US, and that I feel has seen a lot of ups and downs and very interesting developments. I think both under Biden administration as well as his predecessor Donald Trump. But if we particularly look at the Biden administration and the more recent years, Biden has obviously talked about this whole concept of establishing guardrails that can stabilize the relationship, and something that we keep hearing about when in our conversations about US-China relations. But at the same time, and of course, after that conversation, this US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was supposed to visit China, but then the balloon incident happened earlier this year, and that disrupted that plan. So at the same time, I see that there is a certain duality in terms of how US is approaching China. On one hand, for example, in the recent G7 summit, there were very tough words that were used against China. But almost simultaneously, Biden also said that he expects a thawing of relations between the two countries in the near future. And we've seen that there have been some level of diplomatic meetings in the last few weeks between US and China, but China seems to be more amenable to having engagements on the economic side, whereas it has turned down requests for meetings on the security side, for example, in the recent Shangri-La dialogue. But at the same time, it's also interesting to see both China and US talking about the dangers of having a conflict, etc. Especially if we look at the most recent speeches that they've made, the Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu made at Shangri-La dialogue. So do you see this duality as some kind of a contradiction? Because also other actors like the EU, for example, have something similar, where there are almost like parallel tracks going on. So how would you read these signals, which seem to be a bit contradictory?
See, I think what you refer to as contradictory is perfectly normal in democratic dispensations, right, with multiple stakeholders and interest groups contending with each other. I mean, right, the thing is that as long as all voices are heard and a sound decision can be made, this is fine. So in a sense, I would say there's both strategic clarity as well as duality in the United States, in EU, in India, because we have multiple stakeholders, right, multiple ideas and views that need to be taken into account. There's not one person directing what the direction, or deciding what things the direction should be. If we had that, then we wouldn't have the best of opinion or creativity or ideas coming into how we might deal with another country or another relationship. Having said that, there is no question that the Chinese Communist Party poses a genuine threat to democracy everywhere, right? But from the point of view of some stakeholders, especially economic players in the West, even in India, China is a land of opportunity, profits, of lax labor laws, of getting cheap goods, of easy investment or funding available for cutting edge research or app development. And scientists and engineers are particularly very pleased with the kind of facilities that they have in China. So there's always going to be this pressure of wanting to continue engagement with China, right? Among inside democracies, and whether Western or third world. But there comes a point, I think, where the politicians need to understand the bigger picture. And right now, in the US and in Europe, I think the political class is contending with the economic class. I mean, look, there is really no solution to Western greed. China's actions, China's, rise towards this sort of an aggressive posture that we see today was deliberately ignored for many decades by Western leaders under pressure of their economic corporations because they wanted profit and business with China. They just thought that they could handle or manage China. And China is proving that it cannot be managed or handled, in the by negotiations or peaceful engagement anymore, because China is out to change the laws of international politics, the rules and the norms of international politics, and it is willing to change them to the detriment of Western or Indian or Asian democracies. Because like I said, the core point is that if choice exists in another political dispensation, as it does in democracies, where people can vote for a different political party to come to power, right? That same question will also come to the mind of Chinese people. And as long as that possibility exists, the Communist Party will feel itself under threat. So that's what's going on here. And until countries dealing with China can figure this out, that this political contestation is the bigger issue in their relationship with China, then all these talk of guardrails will only be that, because those guardrails will never be genuine. It can be tactical, it can be temporary. The Chinese want to take a breather, or the Americans do not have the resources at this point in time to deal with the Chinese, but it cannot be sustainable. So I think this is a problem that Western leaders need to deal with. They need to educate their peoples about. They need to educate their administration, civil services. It needs a whole other system approach to deal with China.
To talk about a more recent sort of a trend, which is, of course, the big sort of development in global politics today is the Ukraine war. And I wanted to also ask you about whether that has allows China to kind of buy time, if I can put it that way, in delaying its own possible confrontation with the US, or it could also be the other way around, where it could buy time for the US to, probably delay its confrontation with with China. Or do you think, on the other hand, it has increased China's diplomatic relevance to a point where the US in particular, or the West in general, will find it very difficult to alienate China going forward?
Look, I think all of this can be true at the same time. I mean, this is the nature of international politics. People or leaders are those who understand and anticipate changes and are willing to quickly move things around in order to deal with those changes. I mean, Xi Jinping keeps talking about changes unseen in a century. Now, he started saying that well before the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Okay, but his intention of saying it is to again sort of circle the wagons, as it were, in China, to tell the Chinese people that, look, there's a lot of instability and flux outside of China's borders. Therefore, we need to be united. We need to get our act together in order to deal with all of this. Now, the same sort of thing happens in other countries as well. The Ukraine conflict has created opportunities for China, certainly, because it has allowed China to expand its attention or its space in Eurasia, because the Russians are distracted. It has certainly also distracted the Europeans and the Americans to a certain extent, because it could have been, without the Russia-Ukraine crisis, certainly the Americans would have been pell-mell, fully focused in Asia. And many Chinese scholars or analysts have actually pointed this out. But at the same time, you could also argue that, given Russian failures in Ukraine, the Chinese are also worried because for two reasons. One, the Russians are a model for the Chinese military, both in terms of equipment as well as structure, the old Soviet system. So if the Russians are failing in the military combat, if they were unable to prosecute a quick end to the conflict, Russian recruits, low motivation, low morale, poor performance, high casualties, all of these are going to be worrying the Chinese military as well, right? So it has actually forced them to rethink, I think, in many ways, their entire approach to conflict. They were pretty confident at one point of dealing with the Taiwan issue. So this is really the second issue. So in many ways, the timetable for Taiwan is probably complicated because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how this has sort of proceeded. So I think there are also concerns that this raises, because if Russia is weakening, then while China also has expanded space, it will also become more of a target, or more the target of attention or focus. So I think the Chinese need to play this very carefully. I mean, I don't think they know exactly where this is going. I don't think anybody does. But they will make use of the opportunity as much as possible. I mean, look at the recent deals that they've tried to swing, between the Saudis and the Iranians, for example. So the Chinese are making use of this moment where the Americans and the West is distracted to see what they can do in other parts of the world. And that's perfectly rational, legitimate behavior. And I think it also hopefully forces countries like the United States or India to now rethink their own policies and say, okay, look, how do we deal with this more confident China that is, that might actually not be engaged in conflict? If the Chinese are learning a lesson from the Russians, maybe it's also that, look, going into a situation with your military force might not be the best idea. Stick to what the Chinese have been doing until now, salami slicing, this short, limited conflicts or military maneuvers like they do on the LAC or in the South China Sea. And that has got them so far. So I think they might decide to stick with that.
That is very interesting, Dr. Jacob, and because I think a lot of conversations about Ukraine in the context of China and how it affects China's relations with the world generally tend to apply the same template. But what you're saying is that's not necessarily the way we should be thinking. It could be something else. It could be something completely different, or something that China has already been doing, like the strategy of salami slicing. So you mentioned Taiwan, and I also wanted to ask you about Taiwan because it has national elections due next year in 2024. So do you think China will sort of wait and watch before it sort of makes any significant move on Taiwan?
China does both things. It waits and watches, as well as is doing something always on the side. So China has an extensive disinformation and misinformation campaign ongoing in Taiwan as we speak. It's running through the year, 365 days a year, right? It has also indicated its preference for which political party it wants to have in power. Former Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou and former head of the KMT was in China a few months ago, just as President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan was also in the United States, or passing through the United States. So the Chinese preference is very clear. But at the same time, it's not as if the Chinese are just sticking with the KMT. They are also trying to incentivize the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, the current ruling party in Taiwan, their support base into supporting China by offering economic linkages, markets, etc., from the south of Taiwan to China and so on. So it's a multi-pronged approach that the Chinese employ in Taiwan. And also for that reason, again, this is political. These fears of Chinese invasion of Taiwan, I think, are completely overblown. it does not make political sense for the Communist Party of China. It is a way of thinking that the West would adopt. I mean, you look at how the Russians have invaded Ukraine, for example. But the Chinese thinking is a little more complex, and plus, I don't think there's any great stomach for it even within the PLA, for two reasons at least. One, it would be seen as some sort of an internal or a civil war, which would actually weaken China. If you actually believe all this talk about one China, then this is civil war, which would actually weaken China, right? And you conquer Taiwan, and what do you get? You have an unhappy, sullen population that is not cooperative. So you're going to invest a lot of time and effort trying to pacify them. And things have not really gone very well for the Chinese in Tibet or Xinjiang or now even in Hong Kong. Second, I think there is, like I said, especially post the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there is at least a certain lack of confidence that the PLA can actually pull it off. Sure, Taiwan and Ukraine are two different scenarios. The ability of the rest of the world to supply Taiwan the way they have supplied Ukraine is quite different. But then, because of a lack of a land border, Chinese amphibious attacks, etc., this can also take time and has consequences. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party has the capacity to, sell a narrative and call everything a victory, no matter what. But I think politically speaking, just doesn't make sense. And look at the record. I mean, the Chinese have been talking about invading Taiwan for decades now, since 1949. But in that time, they've actually been engaged in the Korean War, in 62 with India, multiple times actually with India, and the Vietnam conflict. They are running the Americans close in provocative, intercepts in the South China Sea. So I think in many ways, this is a bit of a feint. Talk about Taiwan, but do something else somewhere else. So that's, I think, something we need to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think, like there's a lot of sophistication in terms of the strategy that Chinese adopt. That also, I think, is a cause of concern and should be a cause of concern for the other actors in this region, be it in the South China Sea or India as well. And speaking of India, Dr. Jacob, now you have written about how Beijing's aggression hasn't elicited the kind of response that it deserves from New Delhi, whether it is the transgressions at the LAC or even some of the propaganda that China puts out from time to time, like most recently on Arunachal Pradesh. How do you see China's approach to India in particular progressing, especially about how Beijing views New Delhi and what factors also influence its perceptions as well as its potential choices? And also, if I may ask, what are India's responses, potential responses and options, both ideally speaking as well as in terms of our feasibility and doability?
In the Chinese worldview, they are in conflict for number one position with the Americans. Right. And so from a political point of view, it is best that this conflict is a black and white conflict between China and the US, just two contenders. So anybody else that comes and complicates this picture is a bit of a difficult sell for the Chinese Communist Party's narrative machinery or propaganda machinery, because if India comes into the picture and like Galwan, for example, happened and Chinese soldiers lose their lives, I mean, most Chinese were thinking that this conflict is going to happen to the Americans and we will lose our lives or whatever in conflict with the US. But suddenly here's a conflict with the Indians. And so this complicates the issue for the Chinese leadership, because people are going to ask in China, look, you want to deal with the Americans, but you can't deal with the Indians, right? How are you going to deal with the Americans? So from the Communist Party's point of view, it is best to paint India as subservient to the Americans, simply doing American bidding rather than acting of its own volition or having any agency of its own. So this is really the approach that the Communist Party of China takes broadly to India, right? At least in the public domain. On the ground, it might be different, because obviously you can't ignore realities on the ground. India is a big player in Asia and it needs to be dealt with. And the Chinese do two things. One, there is always this talk about, yes, we are great civilizations. Again, this talk about great civilizations is just a way of making India feel like India and China are on the same page. But the internal narratives and discourse in China really has no place for other civilizations. China is number one, and nobody else can come close, right? So, but for external consumption, for the Indian consumption, you will have to talk about, or India and China need to work together. Chinese are very concerned about Indian strategic autonomy, for example. They are trying to tell the Indians, look, you don't have to do the American bidding. So there's a desire to keep the Indians engaged in BRICS, or the Russia, India, China trilateral. And in my personal view, these are completely, pointless talk shops. They haven't really achieved much by way of foreign policy goals for India, except maybe for India to signal to the Americans or the West, like, look, we have other options. But these are not really options that have helped India gain anything substantive. I'm not saying that I'm not advocating for a complete no holds barred India-US partnership, or eyes closed India-US partnership. I think the India-US partnership will also have its problems. Indians have to finally, and I think in many ways the government and many of the strategic community understand this. India thinks of itself as a third pole in global politics, right? And it is a voice and a pole that needs attention, that needs to be heard. But that is not how the rest of the world might necessarily look at it. And a lot of that is really our problem, our fault. I come back to the point about how much do you invest in studying the outside world? How much do you invest in educating your own people about the outside world? China is your biggest foreign policy challenge. But before that, it was Pakistan. But exactly how many experts on Pakistan, or think tanks on Pakistan devoted to Pakistan, do you see in this country? So, there's talk of one kind, but on the ground, there's very little capacity building to deal with India's external challenges. So I think if you look at it, this is a problem that we need to fix, right? If you ask about what should be India's response and options, we need to understand the rest of the world better. To increase capacity in the civil services, in the military, in the academic world, in terms of languages, area studies, travel grants for Indians to travel and understand foreign polities. Today everybody's talking about Pakistan and China, but what is our level of understanding of Central Asia, or of Africa, or of Southeast Asia? So, without all of this, there's really no Indian foreign policy as such. It's just a lot of talk. Big talk, yes, certainly. And I think up to a point we can hold our own with just talk, but we have feet of clay. So in the meantime, I think China will continue to provoke, needle, continue with its salami slicing. And my view, and my personal view, has always been that if you have a problem on the LAC with China, that needs to be dealt at the LAC. Yes, sure, you can ban Chinese apps and put restrictions on Chinese companies, but then you are sort of spreading the conflict, or the wider, and then opening up opportunities for the Chinese to also attack you or undermine you in other areas, which will always happen, of course. But something on the LAC needs to be dealt with on the LAC. And I think the Indians have been too careful, too cautious, too afraid, believing that China will immediately scale up the conflict all along the LAC. Look, China also has a two-front situation to worry about. And if this terrain is tough for India, this terrain is also tough for the Chinese. And by waiting too long after Galwan, I think we've allowed the Chinese to build up capacity and capabilities on the ground on the LAC. It's just made our job much harder. And now we are engaged in sort of interminable negotiations. And the Chinese are saying, well, things are normalized or normal on the border. We keep saying it isn't, but really it's not going anywhere as far as I see. So at some point, we need to have like for like responses. Else, this will just be talk. And there is also a credibility issue, because the rest of the world is looking at how India is able to deal with China. And from their point of view, I would argue that India isn't doing a very good job dealing with China. What looks like it is India is, depending on the Americans, depending on the Quad, etc., to deal with China. So, and sort of an Indian push or an Indian reaction to China, one-on-one, is largely missing.
To ask you, Dr. Jacob, in the context of India, but more generally as well, in terms of Chinese foreign policy, if there is a certain sense of urgency that Xi Jinping has, because it is his third term, and some analysts have argued that this is a decade where Chinese power is sort of, if not declining, at least certainly probably plateauing, where it has reached its sort of zenith. And maybe the opportunities that Xi Jinping and China might have in the future may not be as probably convenient or as doable right now. So in terms of taking big risks, be it with respect to Taiwan or with respect to other countries, is there a certain urgency that you feel might push China into more aggressive behavior?
There certainly are a bunch of issues where the Communist Party feels challenged internally. In terms of economic growth, the declining demographic, this constant concern whether China will become old before it became rich, and of course, a changing international environment. In the first few decades of this century, there was the belief that this was a strategic window that China had for doing all that it needed to do to get to a position where it could challenge the United States. That window has by and large closed, right? I think the Chinese are aware of it. The Chinese will continue to talk about negotiations and peace building and global stability, etc., whatever. But we can be sure that the Chinese will only do or engage in this for two reasons. One, because they want to prop up their own regime, or two, to make the Americans or Western powers or Western democracies or any democracy to look bad. So in a sense, you could argue there's an urgency, but I don't think we should overread the urgency to assume that China will initiate conflict.
Right.
Because why would Chinese initiate conflict if what they're doing right now in terms of salami slicing in the South China Sea, in the LAC, is bringing them the results, right? You don't see either the Southeast Asians or the Indians actually physically taking up cudgels. I mean, except in the case of Galwan, or one or two incidents here and there on the LAC. But this is just response. The Indians and the Southeast Asians aren't initiating anything.
Right.
And as long as there is no initiative on the other side, then I think the Chinese understand that they can play it cool. They can do exactly what they've been doing. They don't need to scale up, use more of their resources and so on. The challenge really is, how is the narrative inside China going to respond, right? How are the people inside China going to respond? Because look, we've been saying that a lot of this foreign policy aggression is also the result of trying to build up credibility internally. And when internal problems grow, then the Communist Party might be constrained to act externally. But to this, I think, with the use of technology, authoritarian states have become more capable of managing and controlling their populations, not just in China, but elsewhere as well. So my belief is that they will more or less have the internal situation well under control, prevent large-scale mobilization of protests, etc., inside China. There is now enough decades of teaching about nationalism or of Chinese greatness, etc., that the Chinese people will also be extremely careful in challenging the government, or in sort of using foreign policy as a stick to beat the government with. And there'll be limits to that. So
Right.
I don't think that Xi Jinping will find it too urgent a task. They will do what they need to do at their own pace. They will not let somebody else set the pace for them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way for them to control situations that they face, rather than sort of putting themselves into a vulnerable position, both externally and internally.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. I think this has been a very comprehensive discussion about Chinese foreign policy. I think we've had an opportunity to cover quite a few geographies in this conversation, from Taiwan to India to the US, some of the most important questions of Chinese foreign policy. Thank you for sharing your insights, and I hope you enjoyed coming back to the IPCS.
I did. Thank you very much for having me back, and I look forward to staying in touch. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Jacob. And thank you to our viewers. And please do let us know what you think about the conversation in the comment section. Thank you.